Rabbi Jason Rubenstein. They clearly want to hear the Torah that you have to share. Just a brief introduction to say to you how inspired I personally am by you, because during the worst time to be on any college campus post October 7th in recent memory, during a really tough time to be on Harvard's campus in particular, you made the choice to come specifically to Harvard, to be there for the children who are there, the students, all of the faculty and staff who are in desperate need of Torah to lift them. And you came and you brought it, and you're bringing it to us tonight. So thank you so much for sharing your words of uplift with all of us here at Temple Emmanuel. One note for all of you, Rabbi Rubenstein is going to start out sharing with us Torah that he has shared to help his students find uplift and resilience at this time. But do not worry, he will get to what it has been like on Harvard's campus tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi Robinson. It's incredible to be here. I've been a huge fan of this community, your amazing rabbinic and cantorial team, the incredible young people who emerged from this community. I was just talking to Ben Cotton's parents. I had the privilege of spending 4 years with him at Yale, and it's wonderful to see you all here tonight. I'll just share before we start. For many years, I was at Yale Hillel for 6 years. Today is my 1-year anniversary as the director of Harvard Hillel, which is the place where I met my wife. I met my first boss. I really encountered a thickly observant and compelling Judaism that led me to really kind of join the conservative movement. And the thing that, normally talking to students helps you speak to alumni and parents, because you can say, here's what's really going on, and we'll get to that by 7:50. And also, since October 7 in the last 600 and some days, it's the conversations with alumni and parents and concerned members of the Jewish community that's been such a source of strength and inspiration for students on campus, to be able to tell them that, like, on campus, right, you're a small minority, you're 5 or 10 or 15% of the community here, but there are thousands, millions of people out there in the world who care about you, even if they haven't met you. And all of us being here tonight is one piece of that, and I just want you to know how important that presence is. So for the next 40 minutes, I want to study together. And like the best learning in the tradition of Maimonides, there will be a very porous border between Torah and philosophy and our own experience as people who think and feel our way through the world. And my goal is going to help us think about and maybe feel more grounded in a set of very pressing and very difficult questions that have erupted since October 7th have become unavoidable. And I'm going to put them very, very broadly in two ways. One is, how did we get here? And two, what do we do? Right? How did we get here in the sense that, what do you do when the only way for Israel, for our people to defend ourselves, Israel being itself an attempt to find a way for the Jewish people to defend ourselves in modernity, when being a diaspora wasn't working, we were being persecuted across Europe or being massacred in the Holocaust, when that itself requires use of massive violence, even if you believe, as I do, that the IDF is an incredibly moral army acting generally in restrained and methodical ways, we can't turn away from the fact that our survival, our defense, is coming at someone else's expense, at the deaths of thousands and thousands of Gazans, including numerous children. And how do we understand this world that God has thrown us into, and how do we continue to conduct ourselves? How do we move forward with courage and with integrity and with open hearts? And then we'll talk about the state of play at Harvard also, don't worry. So the source sheets in front of you have a lot of material. We're not going to read all of it. We're going to I'll paraphrase the secondary sources, the more modern ones, and then we'll study the rabbinic sources. So it'll be kind of 3 vignettes. One is really a kind of piece of philosophy. One is really specifically about a Jewish theory of redemption, which I think has a tragic component that gives it a bite and a depth that we might not normally appreciate, but might especially need right now. And then the third is actually a moral picture of action. So I'm going to summarize this first source as follows. For those of you who were philosophy majors recently, this will be familiar, but I'll summarize a little bit for the rest of you. So one of the ideas that is most common in Western moral philosophy is called values monism. Monism meaning one, right, like mono. And the idea is that there's a single form of the good. Right? So if you're a utilitarian, right, someone who wants to maximize happiness, the idea is that human experience can be described in terms of happiness, which is a variable, and you can just add it up, and whatever action leads you to the most happiness, go for it. Or if you're a Kantian and you think that everyone should act according to a certain universal moral law, there's a single moral law that you evaluate all actions by. And there are different things, contractualists, et cetera, but all these things that you would learn in Ethics 101 are values monism. And then along comes Isaiah Berlin, Sir Isaiah Berlin, great Russian and then British Jewish scholar. His closest childhood friend, anyone know? Chaim Weizmann, really interesting chapter on Weizmann in Berlin's Reminiscences. And Berlin says, I think this is wrong. And this is kind of summarized in the first source for you. He says, I'm a values pluralist. There are different values, privacy and safety. Right? Can the government demand to see the contents of your iPhone if they think there's evidence of a crime about to be committed? Right? And there may be no single reconciliation, and there may be no single value that harmonizes those two. We just have to pick. I often think about this on travel, right? There's a kind of trip that you go on where you're packed heavy and you're ready for every single occasion, and there's another one where you just bring your backpack and you improvise, and if you have to go buy toothpaste, you go buy toothpaste. And you can't say that one is better, they're just different paths. And Berlin thinks that the world is a struggle between these different values and that there is no single best answer. Another way of saying that is that the idea of utopia is not merely practically impossible, it's conceptually incoherent. There is no definition of a best world. There are just trade-offs. And an open society ought to be people saying, I think we've sacrificed too much equality in the sake of efficiency. I think we've given up too much universalism for the sake of our own solidarity, and other people disagreeing. But you will never reconcile all of these things. This is Berlin. He actually says very moving in his essay. He received an honorary degree from McGill in 1997. And his address to the university said that we've learned from the 20th century, from Pol Pot and the Chinese Revolution and from Stalin and from Hitler, that the single most dangerous idea is the idea that society can be perfected by one idea. That is the idea that has led to the deaths of millions and millions of human beings in the 20th century. And he thinks that is what we need to do, is we need to actually grieve. We need to mourn the dream of a perfect world, and then we can start to live in the world as it is, as moral beings. So in this essay here, there's an excerpt of it from Rabbi Ben Greenfield. Greenfield makes the following suggestion, which we're going to look at one of his best examples, that our rabbis of blessed memory in the Talmud anticipate Berlin. Right, Berlin's writing this in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. His argument is if you go back to 2nd and 3rd century Galilee, you get similar ideas. And the way that he does this is by showing that there are certain moments where, right, you would expect if you were a theistic person, if there were a character named God in your world who'd created the world, that if anyone could harmonize the different values that compete in our lives, God could and would. And again, our rabbis indicate that even God is incapable of harmonizing the different values of the world. So look with me on the bottom of the first page here from Breshit Rabbah, this commentary on Genesis 1:26. God says, we're right in the beginning here, let us make a human in our image. Now this is a major problem because at this point there are no humans, and therefore the question naturally arises, to whom is God speaking? And one of the most natural answers is God is consulting with the angels, right, whom pre-exist humanity. So here we go. Rabbi Shimon said, when the Holy One came to create the first human, the ministering angels formed factions and groups. Some said, let it be created. Others said, don't let it be created. Flip the page with me. Ooh. Some tension. This is the meaning of the verse. Kindness and truth are met together. Charity and peace have kissed. Kindness, said the angel representing the value of kindness, says, let humans be created. Let us be created. For we will perform acts of kindness. This is chesed. The world will be barren of kindness, that is. But truth said, don't let humans be created, for they are entirely falsehood. Charity said, tzedakah, said, let it be created, for it will do acts of charity. It will care for those who have less. But peace said, don't let it be created, for it is entirely violence. So what did the Holy One do? 2-2, right? God calls the angels to session, kind of, right, Robert's Rules of Order, bangs the gavel, has a vote, and it's stuck. Oh, geez, it's like one of the first lessons in how democracy maybe isn't like totally perfect, right? And maybe that's one of Berlin's points. So what did the Holy One do? It took truth and cast it out of heaven to the earth. God resorts to low-down, dirty parliamentary tricks to break the stalemate. Now, it's really interesting. God does not say, wait, I can incorporate all of you and I can harmonize this and there's one greater value, right? God is stuck with the deadlock. To use another example, which we use in our liturgy a great deal on the high holidays in particular, right? What does it mean that God has two thrones, a throne for justice and a throne for mercy? And God moves between them. God actually can't, in the image of our high holiday liturgy, occupy them both simultaneously. And God doesn't pick one over the other. God has to choose at different moments which attribute to inhabit, which virtue to inhabit, which value to make real in the world. So the first image I want to offer, this is very, very theological now. We haven't gotten into the, any kind of thing practical about Israel or Gaza or anything like that, and we will, don't worry, is an image that the world itself is not perfectible, and this isn't anyone's fault. Right? The fact that there is suffering, the fact that there's endless debate about how to live is a feature of human life, but even more than that, it's actually a feature, it's metaphysical. It's a feature of God's existence also. Right? And here the rabbis sound very much like Berlin. They don't think that there's a way to harmonize these different approaches. The world is just shot through with conflict. And so one of the ways to think about this, I want to be really clear, there's that old joke, I don't know who it's from, the difference between an American and a European is that Americans think that peace is war and Americans think that peace is the norm and war is the exception, and Europeans think the opposite. Right? This is kind of something similar. You might think, like if you were trained in geometry or you were trained in, kind of books with happy endings or Hollywood movies, that the natural end of things is harmonization. But this is more like people who like, those dark European movies, right? Where it's like actually the natural state of things is kind of disarray and confusion. And part of what's kind of interesting and perplexing about this is you might think, this says something kind of just the opposite of I think how many of us think of the world. You might think that, this is a very secular way to see the world, that there is different values. But to be a religious person means that there's one right way of action. Or there's a sense that beyond all the contradictions we see, there's a sense of harmony. And this says maybe even just the opposite. If you're a modern secular philosopher, you might think that there's one standard like human reason. But to be religious means to be alive to the irreconcilability of the different forces that shape us. I'll give you one of the most wild examples from our liturgy, which isn't on this source sheet. That line at the end of the Aleinu, right, that you could probably all sing by heart, right? Bayom hahu yi Adonai echad u'shmo echad. On that day, in the future redeemed world, God will be one and God's name will be one. Now, normally we just sing that and we sit down and we're ready for Kiddush to start. But if you stop and think about it, you're like, wait, if then in the future, in a different, better redeemed world, God will be one and God's name will be one, what does that mean about God now and God's name right now? And in fact, the Talmud is alive to this and says, in that day, there will only be one blessing. Blessed are you, God, who does good, hatov v'ametiv. But nowadays, God has multiple names in this world. When there are good things happen, we say hatov v'ametiv. And when bad things happen, we say baruch dayan ha'emet, the true judge. And the sense here, right, is it's not just that we are misperceiving the world. Everything is actually good. We just, because of our human smallness and our frailty, see some things as bad, but we're mistaken if we could really see them from God's eye view. It's actually saying, no. Right now, in this world, God is not a single entity. God manifests in contradictory ways that cannot be reconciled. It's quite radical. And so the picture I wanted, just the first piece I want to leave you with is, the sense is, there's this joke when you're studying Maimonides in yeshiva, because the kind of classical method of studying Maimonides is you find, oh, he says this here and that there, and he contradicts himself, and you resolve that contradiction, make something fancy. So the joke is, does Maimonides contradict himself? Well, if you haven't found the contradiction, you haven't understood him right. And there's a similar ethos here, right, that until and unless you've arrived at some contradiction which is tragic, in the sense that it's fundamentally irreconcilable, you haven't actually started to think about the problem, or you haven't really engaged with the world as it is. Right? So it's very bracing. And part of what I want to point out here, and I'll just bring this back to the values pluralism, it's actually one of Berlin's students, Bernard Williams, who will show up towards the end of this talk. One of the points he makes in the problem with values, a problem with values monism, like let's say you're utilitarian. And so you say, okay, all I need to do to be a moral person is to choose the greatest good for the greatest number. And someone confronts you with a horrific choice. They hold a gun to your head, they round up your family, and they say, you get to pick one of your children who lives. You have to pick, or I'm going to kill everyone. And you make a choice. And so let's say you're a utilitarian, and you say, okay, I'm going to pick the youngest one, because they probably have the most years to live. So if you're a utilitarian, I just want to think this through, that choice is no more or less significant than what brand of cereal you buy at the grocery store. Your job in making decisions is to choose the best thing for the best number of people. And all the decisions are kind of the same. And you shouldn't feel terrible about it, and you shouldn't feel anything, right? Like, there's just choices, and there's a way to do it, and you did it well, and you move on. And I think all of us feel how ghastly that is, because what's happening here is there's an intuition for the tragic nature of existence in this way of thinking, which captures certain moments that are forced on us. Sophie's dilemma and what I just described, or perhaps the position of the people of Israel and the state of Israel on and after October 7th, right? When you actually would give everything you had to have peace with your neighbors and to have your citizens be protected, and you can't. Right? And that sense of being forced into a tragic situation is now something that sits really kind of, and I want to say on some level, makes sense in this way of seeing the world. Okay, that's the very broad scene. Now we're going to jump into something much more specific. And I have to give just a little bit of background here. In the history of ideas, the idea of how you get to a redeemed world that is different and better, and again, we're going to get to the rabbinic text, which I think is like the core one, which I teach again and again to my students, but we have to put a few chess pieces on the board before you can see how the checkmate comes into focus. So in the classic way of thinking until sometime early modernity around Voltaire, the way that we get from the present world that we live in, with all of its degradation, with all of its suffering, with all of its ugliness, to a redeemed world, where God's presence is manifest and human dignity is real, is not through linear progression, right? It's not like, oh, the gender wage gap is 77 cents on the dollar right now. In 5 years, we'll get it 78 cents, then 79 cents, then 81 cents, then 89, right? Eventually, we'll make it there, right? Or unemployment will be reduced, or, all these things, like the way that we kind of come to believe in and practice and build a world of progress. That's not the picture of the arc of history at all in classical sources, Jewish and otherwise. The picture is actually kind of deeply pessimistic one, that the world is like basically a bad place, but it's in a more or less a steady state, and at some point an apocalypse will destroy the world order as we know it, and then a better world can rise out of its ashes, right? And this is part of the appeal of the certain style of Marvel-type movie, right? You've seen many of these. I'm partway through the three-body problem trilogy. Similar ideas, right? Like the appeal of the sense of the destruction of the world and the construction of a new one after. And the idea is, so if you have your graph of how human history is going, right, instead of it's in the x-axis is time and the y-axis is how good things are, right, instead of our picture that's just kind of getting better and better, it's kind of flat, and then it gets way worse, and then it gets way better, okay? That's the arc of history in this world. Okay. That's the idea that we need to have in the background as we read this. And now this is going to be intellectually difficult what we're about to do. But my hope is it's like, when you have a good physical trainer and you like feel a little bit sore afterwards, and you're like, that's how I know I got a good workout. You're like, your brain's going to be a little bit like, wow, I can't believe I held all of those texts in my head, but you're going to feel great that you did it, okay? So here's your workout, okay? Here we go. So we have to put two different sets of verses on the table in addition to that idea of apocalypse that I just described. So the first is from Jeremiah, and I want you to kind of feel the difference between these two sub-paragraphs I'm about to read. Okay, for days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel and Judah, said the Lord, and I will bring them back to the land that I gave their fathers, and they shall possess it. It's very happy, right? This is, as we say in classical Jewish thought, Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. This is redemption. And these are the words that the Lord spoke concerning Israel and Judah. Thus said the Lord, we have heard cries of panic, terror, without relief. Ask and see. Surely men do not give birth. Why then do I see every man with his hands on his loins like a woman in labor? Why is every face turned green? Ah, that day is awesome. There is none like it. It is a time of trouble for Jacob, but he shall be delivered from it. So if the first paragraph was in a major key, this is in a minor key. And I want to point out, this is a kind of a feminist moment here, and since I'm a conservative show, why not? There's a way that Jeremiah is making use of the all-male nature of the audience he's addressing. And what I mean by that is he's speaking to men who are aware of the fact of labor and that it is a type of pain and distress they know that human beings can undergo, but they themselves can't quite imagine. And he's saying, just like that is going to be what it's like for people in the end of days. Right? It's something you can kind of imagine, but you know that it's worse than anything you've ever felt. Right? It's actually like a very interesting thing that he's doing. How would he have written this for an egalitarian audience? I have to bring him back and ask him. Okay, so that's scene one, is we have this strange movement back and forth between the kind of celebration of redemption, anticipation of redemption, and a sense of a prophecy of warning and like profound kind of rupture and dismay. Okay, that's Jeremiah. Then we have Amos. So Amos, great prophet here, what Amos is particularly upset about in this context is he's addressing Jews who are kind of not on the right side of economic justice, who are oppressors, and who are praying for redemption. He says, you clearly don't understand what you're praying for, because if you did, you wouldn't, because the day of the Lord, God's not going to be on your side, okay? And he's kind of upset about this. So he says, you who wish for the day of the Lord, why should you want the day of the Lord? It will be darkness, not light. Like a man who runs from a lion only to be attacked by a bear. If he comes indoors and leans his hand on the wall, he's bitten by a snake. Surely the day of the Lord will be not light, but darkness, blackest night without a glimmer. That's like this apocalyptic destruction. Okay, turn the page with me. We're going to skip down. The top part is Sholem, this description of apocalypse. Okay, so now we get to the part where it says Bavli Sanhedrin 98b. This is a remarkable text. It's actually Rav Yehuda Amital, who was one of my teachers, said he was a great Israeli. He was a Holocaust survivor, a founder of one of the great yeshivot in Israel, Yeshivat Har Etzion. And he said this was the one piece of Talmud he wished every Israeli Jew knew. So let's see what it says. Rabbi Yochanan, the greatest sage of the Jewish community in the Galilee in the 3rd century, said, the Messiah should come, but I don't want to see him. Why not? The Talmud's very curious. So the assumption here, right, again, is that the Messianic era has this kind of decline in it. The question is, what's the label of the y-axis? What's lost there? So Reish Lakish said, and the Talmud's going to do something it often does, where it floats a possibility and then only to reject it. So we're about to, in order to kind of sharpen the idea that's going to come, to say I'm not just saying that it's X, I'm saying it's not Y and X. I entertained the possibility of Y and I rejected it, so you could be confident that I meant X when I said X, okay? So the Talmud's going to say, well, what's Rabbi Yochanan worried about losing? Perhaps it's the following. Why did Rabbi Yochanan say this? You might say that it is because of the verse in Amos 5, right? You're fleeing from a bear and a lion and a snake. But we find that occurring in our times. And read this description. And this is like, Father, I have a 2.5-year-old daughter around here. This is like, it hurts to read and it ought to hurt to read. When a man goes out to the field and is stopped by a centurion, a man leaves his home in the morning, a Jewish man in Roman Palestine, to get food for his family during the day. He goes out to the field, he collects them, but he's stopped by a centurion, a Roman soldier, who says, I would like those potatoes you dug. Not potatoes, those are New World food, but whatever, the wheat you harvested. Centurion claims it from him. That's like a lion. So then the man comes into the city. Maybe he works as a day laborer for a few hours, but he's stopped by a tax collector who seizes the money that he got from working. It's like a bear. And then he comes into his own home and finds his sons and daughters faint with hunger. It is as if a snake bit him. Right, the image of like the pain, right, of this father listening to his children cry themselves to sleep in hunger and knowing that he's done everything he can to provide for them and has failed. It's devastating. What the Talmud is saying for its purposes, whatever Rabbi Yochanan is concerned about the Jewish people losing in the birth pangs of the Messiah, it's not socioeconomic, right? We're on the bottom rung. Can't really get any worse. Famine could come, wars can come. We don't really have anything to lose. And I want to pause and point out here something that's just remarkable and ought to feel you, like, I think this will kind of be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's from my teacher, Professor Seth Schwartz. So it's hard to say this idea in a coherent way, but I think it'll come through. The Jewish community of Palestine as a Roman province was poor. And we know this because there was no one of senatorial level of wealth or even equestrian level of the wealth. The next down, or the one below that, I forgot what it's called. And the thing that's remarkable is out of the entire Roman Empire, the Jewish literature from the land of Israel is the only literature that survived from such a poor place. It's actually the only record we have of what any poor people in the entire Roman Empire. And to think about what that means for our ancestors, right? That they had nothing, and yet they produced literary geniuses like Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish and Rabbi Akiva, and students who could preserve their works. It's an incredible, incredible thing, right? Completely unprecedented in history. But we still don't know what Rabbi Yochanan was afraid of losing. So watch this. Rather, we're going to find out now. It is because it is written, ask and see, right? We know these verses. Do men give birth? And why do I see every man with his hands on his loins like a woman in labor? Why is every face turned green? What is the meaning of kol gever, every man? Rav Bar Yitzchak said in the name of Rav, the Almighty, kol gvura. So it's not just every man, whose hands are in his loins like a woman writhing in labor. It's actually the Almighty God self is torn by conflict. And what is the meaning of every face turned green? Rabbi Yochanan said, the residents of the upper realms and the residents of the lower realms. When God will say, right, as the Jews are coming back into the land, that's what these verses in Jeremiah are about, these people are the works of my hands, and those other people are also the works of my hands. How could I displace these for the sake of those? So the image is, as God is bringing the Jewish people into the land of Israel, God is torn by a moral conflict and saying these people who are already in the land are also the works of my hands. How can I displace these for the sakes of those? Or in other words, the thing that Rabbi Yochanan is concerned about losing is the moral purity of the Jewish people. And in the Talmud's frame, and I want to be clear, he's so extreme that he says, yeah, I'm willing, the Messiah should come, but I don't want to see him. I'm willing to pay the price of Jewish parents listening to their children cry themselves to sleep in hunger forever. Now, the thing that's most remarkable about this piece of Talmud, right, you have God and you have Rabbi Yochanan, who disagree on whether the Messiah should come, but the one thing they agree on is there are no happy endings. The Jewish people can either look their children in the eyes, there will be a certain moment in history, I should say, when the Jews will have the opportunity to step out of a place of vulnerability and powerlessness and provide for ourselves and protect our children. And we will have to look our children in the eyes and say we did or didn't take that opportunity. And if we don't take it, we can say, look, we've preserved our purity as they cry themselves to sleep in hunger. And if we do take it, we will say, we had an option to be morally pure, and we gave it up for you. And God and Rabbi Yochanan take different routes. But the thing that they agree on is there is no possibility of a happy ending here. And I want to point out kind of what I would call a left version of that and a right version of that. The left version of it is saying it's not just because, the Jews in the Yishuv in the 1930s didn't try hard enough to build bonds with the local Arabs. Or it's just because of the forces of colonialism, or it's just because of some, we just didn't have that, then everything would have been okay. It's like, no, things will never be okay, and we all need to be okay with that. But it's also not the right-wing version that says, this is God's will that the Jews come back into the land. Why is anyone crying about anything? There's nothing to be upset about. God said, I will bring them back to the land. God has brought us back to the land. These are ours. We should be wholehearted. Right? Those two positions are the one thing that Rabbi Yochanan and God agree on is that those are not right. Right? You can go your different routes here, and God and the Jewish people have chosen one route. But there is this kind of voice of the loss that comes with that. or the picture that you cannot, in fact, have it all. Similarly, right, this is a rejection of a kind of self-satisfied diasporism. We can always be safe in the diaspora, right? This is a different type of kind of left position one hears nowadays and heard all through the 20th century. So this is the text I've come back to again and again and again with my students, because I think part of what is so hard, especially about being a young person, like, I mean, myself, funny, so I was born in 82, I'm 43 years old, so my earliest political memory is the Berlin Wall coming down, right? I have sometimes say to students, I'm about the youngest person who can remember when the world was a hopeful place. Right, I started college in 2000. The first week of college was the beginning of Second Intifada. The first election I voted in was Bush v. Gore. 9/11 was while I was registering for classes my sophomore year. And part of what I think is hardest for students nowadays is to give up on that dream, and for all of us, and it ought to be hard, and it ought to hurt. But the picture here that I want to frame, and then we're going to kind of give one more picture, which is a little bit more action-oriented and hopeful, and then we will talk about the state of the Jews at Harvard. Don't worry. I know you're all waiting with bated breath. That's what you really came to hear, right? At least for some of you. But the thing that I want to describe here is that there's a sense of a release of guilt, maybe of anger, of recriminations, and a sense that, like, this is no one's fault that we got here. Okay, scene 3. But what if we've gone too far? And that was, I mean, if you take this really very, very far, and this is the kind of where do we go from here that I want to think on for the last 10 minutes of this segment. It doesn't matter what we do at all, right? It's tragic. You can go this way, you can go that way. There's no better and no worse. And that's not where I think we want to end up, because it's not true, right? Our actions do have meaning. It can be better and worse. Even if there is an irreducible tragedy, even if there's, I often call it, a low ceiling to redemption, that doesn't mean that all ceilings are the same height. I just say one more way of describing this last text, which I think is quite remarkable, is that it says, right, the tragic nature of history is so powerful, so immutable, so transcendent, that even after redemption, Jewish existence is still tragic. Right, that's the picture. And I want to point out, that's actually in some ways the picture of the Torah itself. I think about, like, Moses dreamed of entering the land of Israel. Right, what does it say at the beginning of Parshat Shoftim? Right, pick for yourselves judges who do not take bribes. Let's just unpack that for a moment. That means when you enter the land of Israel, Jews will get in conflicts with each other that they won't be able to resolve, and they'll need judges. And some of those Jews will resort to bribing those judges. And that's like the dream that Moses doesn't get, right? Like, I mean, it's actually really interesting to think about. Like, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but like the idea of like being in the land of Israel and having a prime minister who's being indicted for corruption charges and a fight about whether those charges are legitimate, that's exactly the dream of Parshat Shoftim. And Maimonides is Maimonides is the one who's kind of most sober and biting on this point. He says, like, those people, he's like, all of those promises about like the line laying down with the lamb, those are all metaphors. It's like, what do you think? God is going to change the like metabolic chemistry of lions so they eat grass? Like, there are certain things built into the nature of who and what we are. That we are like conflictual creatures, that we have, as the angels said, streaks of deceit and violence within us. And you have to confront that. I'll just one more example of this, and it's back to the theological level. Professor Christine Hayes, who was my teacher at Yale, pointed out that these other verses in Jeremiah and some in Ezekiel that are very beautiful, right? God says, in those days I will give you a new heart, a heart of flesh to replace your heart of stone, or I will write my law in your innermost parts, which are the most beautiful, moving, soaring verses, are also the most depressing. Because they mean that until and unless we are replaced with a different type of being, which is in some way more than human, in some way less than human, we should expect the same amount of confusion, conflict, uncertainty, struggles for power, etc. That is like what it means to be us, and we kind of have to come to terms with that. There is no way out. But how do we live within that? So I have to do, this is the other kind of intellectually difficult piece, part number 3 here, which is on the very last page. So I have to lay out a little bit of intellectual history, which is in some ways its own Jewish story here. So Isaiah Berlin, who we opened with, his great student was Bernard Williams, who was not Jewish. And Williams made one of his kind of most important arguments in the history of ideas was a criticism of the way that Aristotle read Greek tragedy. And this is like a lot of layers here, but stick with me because it's going to be worth it. So in classic Greek tragedy, these horrible things happen, and there's a sense that it's fate. The character couldn't have escaped it. And Aristotle is unwilling to confront fate. He always thinks that someone has made a bad choice. And the great moment of moral cowardice for Aristotle is when he says, he justifies chattel slavery, because he says real noble people would never allow themselves to be enslaved. They would choose death over enslavement. Therefore, we know that slaves are lesser than we are because their ancestors made the choice to be enslaved. Our ancestors would have died before making that choice. And therefore, there's a moral backstop because there's a human choice behind every institution, rather than being like, that's a horrific thing. Some people like lost in battle because their general made a bad decision and they were hit over the head and they woke up in a different place, and they tried to make the best of it from there. And it's a horrific thing being a human being, how little control and how little justice there are. So Williams thinks that the primary move he swings the pendulum all the way to the other side, that confronting tragedy is about confronting how little control we have over our lives. Okay. Then along comes Martha Nussbaum. Martha Nussbaum, the great philosopher at the University of Chicago, an adult convert to Judaism in her own right, thinks that Williams has gone too far, as often happens in corrections in the history of ideas, and thinks that actually the work of watching Greek tragedy is, and I want to read the quote here. If you start in the middle of that paragraph in the middle of the last page, I shall suggest, this is Nussbaum's voice, that one of the valuable contributions of Greek tragedy to ethical thought is in fact a subtle process of deliberation about luck and bad human behavior, as we are again and again led to ask ourselves. This is the question that ought to be running in your mind as you watch a Greek tragedy, according to Nussbaum. What in the terrible events we witness is sheer luck and necessity, and could not have been otherwise? What, by contrast, is human folly, rapacity, and negligence, and could possibly have been otherwise? And I will share with you, there is no better framing of reading the news for the last 600 and some days than I think this question. What is built into the nature of conflicts between people, and what was a bad decision that was made here or there by this or that person, country, faction, etc.? Right, the idea that, yes, there may be a tragic matrix in which we're embedded, and that doesn't mean that there's no meaning to our actions. And now I want to, just like the first piece about saying how, the rabbis anticipated Berlin, I want to offer a suggestion here from a text that I learned from David Arno about the way that our rabbis of blessed memory anticipate Nussbaum. So I'm going to explain this here, and then we'll jump in. So this is one of the times when the rabbis notice a gap in the narrative of the Torah and try to fill it in. And that gap is one that, if you're like me, until you'd read this text, you never noticed, which is Moses announces the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn. And here's the problem. When Moses announced the 7th plague, hail, the Torah tells us that some of the Egyptians respected Moses' prophecies and feared them, and as a result brought their slaves and their cattle indoors, and that those who did, those slaves and cattle were saved. And at that point, Moses' record was only 6 out of 6, and the stakes were only slaves and cattle. Okay, but now Moses' record is 9 for 9, and the stakes are your firstborn. Don't you imagine that some of the Egyptian families would have tried to do something? So now read with me. When Moses said, God will smite all the firstborn, some of the Egyptians were afraid and some weren't. Those who were afraid brought their firstborn to an Israelite and said, please, I beg you, take him in with you for the night. Right, you can imagine the scene, right? Because the blood is on the doorpost, right? That's what's going to protect the people in the house from the angel of death. And there's a knock. Like an Egyptian mother or father, maybe both show up with their child and say, would you take our child into your house for the night to save them? And there are different versions of the scene, right? It might be a 17-year-old who's babysat your kids. It might be a tiny infant who will be terrified being separated from her mother. So what did the Jews do? When midnight struck, God killed all the Egyptian firstborn. As for those who were in the houses of the Israelites, God passed between the Israelites and the Egyptians, taking the life of the Egyptian and leaving the Israelite alive. So we learn that at least some of our ancestors did this incredible thing. And they took the Egyptian kids in. And they said, look, this society needs to be destroyed. Like, you deserve what's going to happen, and yet, I don't want your son or daughter to die. And I'm going to do what I can to save their life. And when I leave, I'm still going to call what happened a victory. That is an incredible thing to hold, an incredible moral achievement. And it's incredible literary achievement for our rabbis to imagine that scene. I can think about the conversations that might happen at a Seder. And so the picture I want to just leave you with here, and then we'll talk about the welfare of the Jews at Harvard also, and leave a couple minutes for questions at the end. But the picture I want to leave you with here is an understanding of Jewish history, or maybe better, a Jewish understanding of history, in which there are no perfect or clean solutions, right? Everyone will have its trade-offs, and there's a space here in the end for the integrity of a person who can hold complexity, right? Who can hold multiple truths, who can want something, who can insist on the justice of a certain movement, a certain act of violence, a certain devastation of a civilization in place, and understands at the same moment that there's a moral clarity to do everything they can to mitigate that, and understands that they may well not succeed, and that they're part of a people that moves forward in history. So I wanted to offer this as some Torah and some philosophy, which is what I kind of most often find myself teaching to 21-year-olds in Ivy League campuses these days. And I hope it's been an example for you. And I always, when I think back to this, think about, this is, I think, the kind of thing that I'm trying to think and feel when I hit refresh on the Times of Israel headlines, right? Or I open the Sunday section of The Economist or the New York Times or something. But it's not the kind of framing that the news can give you, or even maybe like a piece of philosophy you read. It's something that sits like very deep. And my hope is that it rings true. That's useful. To the extent it isn't, you can tell me in the minutes after this talk. I'd be happy to hear some of the pushback. Okay, now we're going to pivot. What's going on with Jews at Harvard? I'm going to take about 8 minutes, I think, and then we'll take some time for questions also, because I imagine there are a bunch. There are a lot of different ways to tell this story. I think the main one I want to tell is as follows. The encampments of the past year and some of the really grotesque anti-Semitism that emerged at Harvard and NYU and Yale and Chicago and Stanford and MIT and Penn America and the arts world. There's nothing unique about Harvard or even particularly interesting about the case here. Was something that had been germinating or gestating for a long time. And I think there are kind of two things to know about it. The first is, and if you read the 311-page report that Harvard's Anti-Semitism Task Force put out, I would particularly in this regard direct you to chapter 2, the history chapter. Because what you see is that in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the aughts and even the early teens, campus held. What I mean by that is there was no shortage of war, Israel and Lebanon, Egypt, right? And yet students talked to each other. And they wrote op-eds, and sometimes they pulled off joint vigils, and sometimes they had separate vigils. But as recently as 2017, the head of the Palestine Solidarity Coalition had dinner regularly at Hillel. And that world doesn't exist anymore. And the reason why is the shift in the theory and practice of pro-Palestinian organizing in America to a strategy which is part of the platform of the BDS movement called anti-normalization. And because we often think, right, when students aren't talking to each other, we say that's a failure. People want to talk to each other, but they don't have the social skills to do it because they grew up on Twitter, or they weren't part of community organizations, so they never saw their parents in committee meetings at Shoals or Rotary clubs arguing, so they're not used to that, right? Which there's something to all of that. But anti-normalization is something different. You can go home and Google it, and you'll find the page on the platform of the BDS movement, which says the idea is that dialogue itself is part of the problem. Because dialogue is premised on the idea that multiple different people contain different valid perspectives that need to be heard and engaged. And dialogue, therefore, obscures the fact that there is an oppressor and an oppressed. And if you just talk with people, you are actually becoming part of the problem because you're participating in the normalization of Israel. Whereas what needs to happen is an anti-normalization where you cannot have dialogue with Israelis or even Zionist American Jews until all parties have stipulated that Israel is an oppressor, settler, or colonialist state, and the goal of this conversation is to work towards dismantling it. And the introduction of that idea is poison to an academic community or even to a human community. And so the first thing I just want to frame for a second is that there's a certain way in which the encampments are very scary for Jewish students, some of the imagery that came out, some of the words that came out, and they were in a different sense the wake-up call that we all desperately needed about something that had been going on for a few years to decades. And I say this as someone who at Yale for 6 years before the past year when I was at Harvard, underestimated the forces that had been gathering on campus. And I would say Barry Weiss was shouting and not enough of us were listening. Now we're listening. And I want to point out the extent that this is something that's reflected in admissions criteria and curricula, et cetera, the real challenge of the Jewish community now is not to get the encampments to go away, because they're, whatever, I can say a few words about that. The real challenge is the encampments are more or less gone, right? At this point last year, I just was on a call with the Hillel International Board of Governors. There were over 100 encampments in May across America last year. There were less than a dozen this year, right? That phenomenon has already gone. The challenge for the Jewish community is to keep our attention once the headlines have passed away on the hiring decisions and the committee decisions, et cetera. I'll give you one example. And I actually learned this from, part of this from Andrea Warshoff-Schwartz, who lives here in Newton. She's a gerontologist at Harvard Medical School. For each of the last 3 years, the number of Jewish first years at Harvard Medical School has been about 5. We're talking maybe 3%. And there was a 75, 80% drop in 1 year. So it turns out 5 years ago, Harvard Medical School revised its mission statement. The old mission statement said the mission of Harvard Medical School is to attract and train the best minds in medicine. And the new version took out the phrase, the best minds in medicine. Now, that's a lot of smoke. Is there fire there? Probably. Someone's got to go and figure out. But the thing that I'm pointing out is this is the kind of thing that is at least as powerful, and I see we have some HMS faculty here with us, in shaping Jewish community life. And none of us were even aware of it. None of us were looking. Not none of us. Not enough of us were. And that's where the action is in the university, right? It's kind of behind the curtain, not in front of the curtain. The second thing I want to say, and by the way, right, in the Harvard College also, Harvard College probably has about 40% as many Jews as it did when I was an undergraduate a generation ago. And that is a much more powerful factor day to day in shaping the lives of Jewish students than whether there's an encampment or not, or what happens in one class, which they probably will decide not to take anyways. I'm gonna give you an example. When I was an undergraduate, I'll never forget this. Early on, one of my roommates was like, was there a big finals club party last night? And I was like, I don't know, but I would be the last person on this campus to know. Why are you asking me? He was like, well, there were a lot of people in suits and fancy dresses, and you were one of them. And I was like, oh, that's Rosh Hashanah. This is the fall of 2000. And last year, the conservative minion at Harvard could not put together first-day Rosh Hashanah services. Right? They went to Cambridge Minion. Now, there's a lot of reasons to that, but I just want to give you, that's the scale, right? From being a thing that you couldn't walk across campus without being what's happening, to not an event on campus, even for the most committed, right? That's what's happened. So I think that we as a Jewish community have done a poor job of telling the story, where you've kind of latched onto the wrong factors. I do want to say one more thing about encampments, because the encampments were much more counterproductive than people realize. So in the fall, right before the election, the Harvard Crimson surveyed the student body, and it turns out that Kamala Harris was much more popular than pro-Palestinian activism, because students had actually been turned off by what they had seen. And I'll share with you an example of this Jewish student I was very close with at Yale, who was very similar in a lot of ways, except he, when he entered, self-described as an anti-Zionist. And this was in reaction to fears, and I'm sure the schools here are different, but this was his experience of a pluralistic day school elsewhere. He said, it's pluralistic about everything except Israel, because if you said the word Palestinian, the teachers would scream at you until you cried and shame you in front of the class. So he came in with these scars. So he said, It was like after about 2 weeks in the encampment, he came into my office and he's like, I don't understand why this is, but as I walk past the encampment, the only thought that pops into my head again and again and again is that all of my favorite Yiddish writers, even though they were Fabrent socialists, were murdered by the Bolsheviks in the Gulag. And then a couple weeks later, there was like little kind of altercations, little violence one night, and he came in and he said, like, now I've seen a mob. And a week after that, when the encampment got kind of even more wild, the head of J Street U at Yale told me, came up and said, Noah, we need to realize they were right when they told us that every leftist movement ultimately turns on its Jews. So to have a dozen years of day school scars undone by 3 weeks of exposure to the encampment, that's like the best thing the Jewish community is like, be more encampments, right? Like, Napoleon always said, never interrupt your enemy when he's in the middle of making a mistake. Right? It's not like, oh, they do X, I have to stop them. I have to think about, like, how is that working out for them? I think the encampments worked out very badly in that sense, right? And that's like an interesting thing. I could share more anecdote there. But the second thing I want to say, and this is like, you're probably not expecting this from like a rabbi in a synagogue, but I have to tell you, like, the story is not anti-Semitism. Just got to say that really clearly. And I'll give you a few examples. A student actually who grew up in this community, I can't name her, not this community, the Newton community, what last year told me, I mean, she told me this year about last year. She said she was actually somewhat sympathetic to the encampment. And she she was asked to lead Kabbalat Shabbat in the encampment. And she said, I don't think I can do it unless I can tell my Jewish friends that I think their concerns about the encampment are misplaced, that they really should come join me. And she said, I didn't think I could say that because of the globalize the Intifada, et cetera. So when she's incredible, she met with the two heads of the encampment. She's like, can you guys just tone it down a little bit? You know, much bigger tent. And she said what followed was the most disturbing conversation she's ever had in her life. They said, well, we know it's actually really alienating and probably counterproductive for us to chant globalize the Intifada. And she said, well, why don't you stop? Well, these kids, the junior in Harvard College, said, no, well, you can't do that because we are loyal members of the global left. And the left has chosen Palestine as its cause, encampments as its strategy, these chants as its tactics, and it would be disloyal for us to not do them, and we have had to sacrifice some of our autonomy for the movement. It's a remarkable thing, right? This helps you understand, right? This person is not thinking about which river and which sea, right? Those videos where the well-dressed reporter is like, which river, which sea? No, and we all laugh and feel superior, right? Like, it helps you understand. They're not thinking about rivers and seas. They're thinking about, like, I'm a good leftist. I'll give you one more example. And I see Rabbi Robinson's like, Jason, you're at time. Come on. So last February, a year and change ago, there was this cartoon that would have been comically anti-Semitic were it not so grotesque that was posted by a few of these student groups and the Faculty for Justice in Palestine. And the image was the back of a hand with a Star of David with a dollar sign in the middle, and two ropes descending from it that terminated in nooses, one around the neck of an African man and one an Arab man, and a sword coming to cut the ropes that said Third World Liberation. This caused a big uproar. It was taken down within a few hours, and in its place was put a picture of Stokely Carmichael, because the cartoon first ran in Stokely Carmichael's Snick magazine in 1967. So these people, again, like, for them, Stokely Carmichael is a demigod, right? And especially if you grow up in a place where, like, you have less of a geographic community, less of a religious community, fewer hobbies, and your politics are the load-bearing component of your identity, it's going to be a lot of cognitive dissonance to be like, wow, maybe there was something bad, something evil in this movement that defines who I am and the people I most look up to. And so in that sense, I think, I describe, like, most students who are anti-Zionist at these universities come to their anti-Zionism via a syllogism. All good people are progressives. All good progressives are anti-Zionists. Therefore, I and all my friends need to be anti-Zionists. And they're not really wrong about the second one, right? Anti-Zionism has been a major feature of Soviet-style leftist thought since really Lenin's writings in the 19-teens, which are cited often in the BDS writings, and in 1924, when this young USSR required all Jewish groups to disavow Zionism in order to maintain their registered status. Why? Because after the Balfour Declaration, all Zionists were ipso facto agents of Western imperialism. Sound familiar? So in that sense, they're just working in this tradition. And I think the actual correct way to remedy these things is to go kind of attack the all good people are progressives major premise. I'll just give you a few examples of how that's being done, and the Harvard Task Force report lays out a lot more. Harvard College added a question to the application that this group of students who were just admitted were the first ones, which said, tell us about a time you met someone who sees the world differently, how it changed your thinking, and how you'd like to do more of that in college. And the story, there's a much longer story here, but I do think, to the extent you're kind of concerned, first of all, thank you for your concern, because I think it's important. Students often do feel isolated, they do feel lonely, do feel concerned about the present and the future. And also, I would say it's very, very important to, come to understand these universities well and choose remedies effectively. And I just want to say, like, the Jewish students at Harvard love being able to come here. They come here for Shabbat periodically, individually and in groups. And knowing that you're here, knowing that you're engaged means a lot to them, and I want to thank you for that. We're at time now. I think we should just pause. You'll tell me what comes next. What do we do now? Thank you all.
What we do now is, because we really are at time, we ask you one final question, which is really, what do we do now? The first piece of your talk was very somber and sober about our role in this world and what we can expect. The last piece was, thank you so much for your support. How do you synthesize the two, and what can we do to help you help Jewish students at Harvard?
So I think the easiest, I'll do the standard rabbinic thing of not quite answering that question. No, the easiest thing is to resist the simple moves. And what I mean by that is, right, the first part of this talk where there's a couple simple moves, like, Israel's right, therefore I'm never going to watch any of those videos of what's happening in Gaza. Or I'm going to try to downplay the statistics as best I can, or I'm not going to read this piece. Or the other side of being like, wow, I'm so troubled by what I've seen or heard that Israel can't be right. And the main thing is just to resist that either or, just to hold the profound, unbearable agony and tension. And then you can kind of choose different paths within that, but I think that's it. And I think it's actually the same thing in the university. Right, the two temptations are oh my God, let's come in there and let's protest and let's bulldoze the encampment and let's fire those professors and do all these things, or to be oh come on, it's not really that bad, and why why are you making such a big deal out of it? And because the university is basically fine and the bastion of reason and liberalism, etc. And if you can just resist both of those, right? If you can just say wow, something here which is amiss and needs work, and anything real that needs work, it first needs to be well understood, and then we need to build a group of people that's going to be effective, and it's going to take actually months to years to decades. That is kind of the move forward, and there is a certain there's a certain kind of emotional difficulty there. None of the easy releases of turning off the news, of shouting at someone, of thinking that it's done and you won't have to follow up on this again. None of those apply. You have to give up on all of those. Talk to people you disagree with, consider ideas that don't quite fit into your worldview, and then keep checking in again for years and years and years to be involved, because none of these stories are going to end, period. And none of them will go well unless we can all actually be the types of people we want everyone to be, including those we, at least at present, disagree with. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, and thank you so much for sharing with us and sharing with our students. I also want to thank all of you for being here tonight. This keynote speech was in memory of Ron and Ruth Silverstein. We are so grateful for their families and for the sponsorship and the Torah that they have shared.